Good afternoon. Welcome to the Data Management Industry Forum for Privacy. This is an EDMworks webinar on the subject of the General Data Protection Regulation. And this afternoon we're going to focus on two specific concepts: privacy by design and consent management. My name is Dennis Slattery. I'm Chief Executive of EDMworks. I've got 30 plus years experience on data architecture and governance implementations, working on large-scale data management projects around the banking and investment sector. In the last 6 months particularly, we've been focusing in on the General Data Protection Regulation, as this is definitely will be one of the key governance drivers for information technology companies, for finance companies over the next 2 to 3 years. As a result of that, we've developed a whole series of e-learning products and also put in place what we're calling the Data Management Agenda for Privacy, which is a series of courses for management, key staff, general awareness, auditors, compliance people, so that it covers the broad spectrum of activities that would be required to get GDPR effectively implemented within your organisation. My other co-presenters are Phil Hingley and Seema Nadler, and I'll pass over to them to introduce themselves right now.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. Phil Hingley, Financial Services Leader for our European Union core team. So this effectively means that here at IBM I'll work with the European Union, European Commission and the affiliated regulatory bodies to help work out how we can best partner with them, but also to help work out what's behind directives that are being introduced, why they're being introduced, who's write the technical standards, and how as an organisation we can partner with our clients, which is a significant portion of the financial services industry, to help them meet these directives.
Hi, I'm Seema Nadler from the Haifa Research Lab. I'm part of IBM's research division. I've worked with lots of different industries, from telco, retail, and several others. My focus in recent years has been on the issue of privacy and trust, and one of the things that we've been looking at is, from a technology perspective, how can we help enterprises understand what sensitive data they have, as well as how to address its handling with regards to GDPR, HIPAA, and other compliance regulations. Again, I'm looking from the innovation and from the technology perspective, how to help you and IBM's customers in general with regard to GDPR as it comes up upon us in 2018.
The discussion points for the webinar today. First is to set some context for GDPR. So we'll take a look at what GDPR is and what's happening in the finance markets, a little bit about the state of readiness within the banks, and then passing on to Phil and Seema in terms of the meaning of privacy by design and consent management. One of the things that we need to focus on is this whole notion of modelling of purpose. Purpose is something we have not had to concern ourselves with within IT or data management development in recent years, and now with GDPR it's become a central theme. So lots of ideas from Seema about how to actually implement that. And then, having looked at the broad concepts around privacy by design and consent management, we then need to think in terms about, well, how do we govern GDPR and make sure that we get governance right? And one of the key things that is going to be required is to make sure that we get communications and training for GDPR rolled out, because GDPR is not just a tick in the box regulation. It is about fundamental cultural change, fundamental change to the way we manage information about people and organizations. And then finally we'll just have a roundup in terms of expert advice for practitioners who have to actually go about implementing the regulation. So let's just get some context around what GDPR is. Privacy laws are essentially about 30 years old. They were implemented in the early 90s, designed in the late 80s, and since then we've had the internet, mobile telephony, social media, mobile apps, a whole new world, a much more engaged and connected world. So effectively the privacy laws have had to be completely overhauled to take into account what the world looks like now, the digital markets that we're engaging in. In front of you there are 3 columns labelled data subject, data controller, data processor. And these are the terms that privacy laws use. On the left hand side we have data subjects. These are the people who privacy laws protect. They relate to natural persons, that's to say somebody from the point of birth to the point of death, and all the roles that you may go through on that journey. So as a child, as a student, as a customer, as a pensioner, as an employee, as a patient, all these different things. These are roles that a data subject may occupy. And that data subject will engage with organisations for specific purposes. So that organisation, take for example, a bank may create a new product, a new type of current account, a checking account. And in that context, the bank will decide what data it requires in order to engage with you and store all the information they need properly and lawfully about you. So in that respect, they control the data that they require. So they're known as the data controller. And that organisation, like many organisations, will consist of a number of business functions. There may be a function to do anti-money laundering checks, to do know your customer, to do credit checks, to actually process payments, make payments, receive payments for you. It may be a mortgage account where there may be some payment difficulties, in which case there'll be some arrears management. And what all these things mean is that bits of your personal data will get put in systems that support each of those individual business functions. So typically your data may be dispersed around different parts of the bank according to the different things that have to happen to that data at any one time. Now that data may be in a shared database, but more likely it's in a number of different systems. And in that column labelled data controller, the bottom section is a matrix. That's an example matrix that might say that this particular person is responsible for this particular set of data in this particular system. So lots of allocation of responsibilities for people for specific data sets. And that's a key tenet of GDPR and all the privacy regulations that are coming out. What data have you got? Where is it? Who's accountable for it? Who's responsible for making sure that it's good? How did you capture it? What consent do you have for it? A whole load of things around it from the data controller's point of view. And then on the right hand side there is this column called data processor. Now it may be that whilst the bank is very, very good at creating current accounts, it may not be very good at, for example, call center handling for customer complaints or queries. So it may be that they outsource that function to a third-party organisation. It might be a subsidiary, it might be a totally external organisation. But in that respect, the processor is operating under contract from the data controller in order to carry out certain specific functions, to carry out certain specific activities using certain data only for that particular purpose. So the data controller has subcontracted that out, and that's typically how the modern world works. And it may be that data processor is in the same country, it may be that data processor is in a separate country, in which case there is a cross-border movement of personal data, and that has to be carried out with due lawful process. And as far as GDPR is concerned, that will make sure that whoever that processor is has to be operating within a legal domain where privacy laws are at least as strong as GDPR. So that's the landscape that we have to deal with. We have data subjects, we have data controllers, we have data processors. All of those are defined within GDPR, and GDPR explains how this whole landscape must operate lawfully and correctly. The headline points for GDPR itself: the implementation date, 25th of May 2018. So by then organisations have to have done everything to be fully compliant. There's a lot to do, as we'll see. The scope of organisations captured, These are processors and controllers, anybody processing or monitoring EU citizens regardless of their location. So whether you're in Asia or North America or Europe or the UK after Brexit, if you're processing EU citizens' data, then you need to comply with GDPR. If you put cookies on EU citizens' PCs or tablets, then you are captured under GDPR, you need to comply. If you have organised manual filing systems about EU citizens, you have to comply. It's not just electronic data, it's any organised form of data. The types of things you have to be aware of, there are a whole new series of rights for data subject, so you have to let them know what information is held, give them access to it, and let them port it to another organisation if they would choose to. You have to give them, rectify their data in the event it's wrong. If you've acquired that information incorrectly or illegally, then you have to erase it. They have a right to be forgotten from a social media perspective, in that if there's information on the internet or in the social cloud somewhere that they wish to have removed, they have the right to have that data removed. They do not have the right to have bad credit history forgotten. They do not have the right to have their transaction history forgotten. There are other laws around that require you to maintain records about people and their transaction history. So there is this notion of proportionality, that GDPR has to be exercised in proportion to other rights, obligations and laws. They have the right to object to processes whereby there is automated decision making being taken based on them being profiled into a race group or a sexual group or something like that. And they have the right to be notified of a data hack. And this strikes at the core of what GDPR is about, because GDPR is about risk management from the point of view of the data subject. So the organisation has to take all reasonable steps to manage the risk of any personal data falling into the wrong hands and therefore causing damage to the data subject. So it's all about risk management from the data subject's perspective. The type of data covered is anything that can identify somebody, any transactional data, social media, any sensitive data, such as trade union membership, sexual orientation, religion. All these things are sensitive data. And it covers data from the moment it's created, where it might be how it's transformed, where it's stored, used, and ultimately that it must be destroyed once you have no legitimate purpose for continuing with it. And it also focuses very strongly on ownership of that data, who is accountable for it within your organisation. To enforce this, the regulator has a whole series of new powers. They are obliged to be notified of breaches or near breaches. They have the right to enter and inspect your premises. They have the right to enter and look at your design documentation to make sure that you've done everything you can to keep people's data safe, that to collect the minimum data required, and that you've captured all the consent for anywhere where you may use people's data for beyond the purposes for which you originally captured it. Which then brings us into the next thing, which is one of the key provisions, is data protection by design and default. So what's the purpose for that data? Why have you got it? Have you got any data that lies beyond the scope of what the transaction required? If so, do you have permission? Have you got consent? So management of consent is now a fundamental new aspect. Purpose is now a fundamental new aspect that you have to record and understand and be able to explain why you've got that data. And if you haven't, you're in breach of the law. There need to be privacy-friendly default settings. So you only ever capture the minimum, that you have. It's very transparent as to what data you're capturing and why you're capturing it. And it's also very transparent about how you gather consent. So it's not good enough to be buried on page 55 of your privacy policy. It needs to be absolutely clear what you're asking for consent for. As far as senior management is concerned, this is a board level agenda. The General Data Protection Act makes it clear it's a board level agenda item. Somebody on the board or somebody accountable to the board who has clear access and easy access to the board, so that the board is fully aware of privacy issues and what's going on. That person or that group of people are clearly accountable for the implementation of everything necessary to become compliant with GDPR. To enforce it, fines and sanctions up to €20 million or 4% of global annual turnover per breach, 10 breaches in a year, potentially 40% of your global annual turnover. Probably won't happen, but that's the law. Plus, you can be sued by data subjects, you can have class actions by data subjects, and as we saw, when you do get these breaches, it may be 20,000 people who are affected. If everybody's bank account details go missing, you could be talking about 10 million, 20 million people. These can be huge. There can be huge potential class action lawsuits. In certain circumstances, while GDPR doesn't impose custodial sentences, it does interact or intersect with other legislative framework like the senior management regime, whereby if a certain management role fails in its duty to make sure that things that should happen, things that shouldn't have happened did happen, then if there's a consistent and persistent failing, then there's a possibility for custodial sentences. And finally, data protection officers have much increased responsibilities. They are accountable not just to the company, they're accountable to the Data Protection Authority to make sure they are informing them of breaches, of any potential weaknesses or flaws within the organisation. And also many data processing organisations who previously haven't needed data protection officers, many of them will now be required to appoint data protection officers in order to make sure that they are properly compliant. So a brief snapshot of the state of readiness for GDPR. This is a recent survey, September 2016, done by Dimensional Research on behalf of Dell. Quite an extensive survey, and I've just taken 3 particular questions from it. Are you aware of GDPR? Is your company prepared? And thirdly, do you have a plan? So are you aware? Many never heard of it. Round about a third knew there was something going on, and a degree that are very knowledgeable. Is your company prepared? Yes, about a third. No, about a third. Don't know, about a third, very roughly. And the big one, do you have a plan? 97% said no, they don't have a plan right now. Lots of people working on it, lots of people in place, lots of people doing stuff, but is there a plan to really work this out? No, not at the moment. So this brings us to one of the core parts of the webinar, privacy by design, consent management, and this modelling of purpose. So what does this mean and how do we do it? And at this stage I'm going to pass over to Seema, who's been doing extensive research on this and has got some great ideas that we want to listen to. Over to you, Seema.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So as we said in the introductions, I'm from IBM Research, and I just wanted to touch on this for a minute and make you all aware of what it means. IBM is one of the few companies that remain that has an absolutely separate research division from its development. We have many research labs across the world. The main research lab is based in New York, the T.J. Watson Research Lab. That's where our headquarters are. But as you can see, we have in several other places in the United States, in Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and I personally am based in the Haifa Research Lab in Israel. The research labs work on lots of different topics in different emphasis. Some are industry focused, some are technology focused, and I happen to be at the crossroads of those two, working both with industries and with the technology focus. And the reason I got into this area was that many of the projects that I have worked on over the past 9 or 10 years, whether it be on augmented reality or indoor location tracking or various other projects in the areas of mobile and sensor type, IoT type projects, One thing that repeated across all of them was that there were issues regarding privacy and compliance with different compliance regulations in different places in the world and for different industries. And so I quickly noted that there was a gap here and a need to be addressed. So when we talk about the GDPR specifically, one of the things that comes to mind very quickly when I look at the state of the art in IT technology today is that even the term purpose doesn't exist in IT systems. So as Dennis pointed out, when we talk about compliance with GDPR, we talk about things like ensuring that there is explicit consent. And when you talk about the explicit consent, it's consent for using personal data for a particular purpose. And the term purpose doesn't exist in the IT systems, but rather you'll hear things like role-based access control or similar terms. So that's the first challenge, is how do we address even defining and modeling purpose in our IT systems? And then another big challenge is, as a data processor, you need to understand what personal data is collected and processed. And that may sound trivial, but it really is not. A given enterprise will have many, many different applications across many different channels that have been developed over time. And it isn't trivial to go back through all of them and identify exactly what personal data is collected, let alone map that to for what purposes is it being collected. But that is, of course, necessary in order to comply with the GDPR. Thirdly, as a data processor, you're now responsible under the GDPR for ensuring that the third parties that you shared personal data with are aware of and only use the data for the intended purpose. So if we said it was difficult and there's a gap today in understanding the purpose and the data associated with it, certainly there's a gap in ensuring that your partners are using it only for the intended purpose. Fourthly, in order to comply with the proportionality requirements of the GDPR, you also need to identify for all of the personal data that you're maintaining, how long does it need to be maintained and stored for each of the different purposes? And this is far from trivial, because you might have one data item. It might be something as simple as my phone number or my address or my location, my real-time location, that is being collected for multiple purposes. And in terms of proportionality, the time that data should be stored is different for each of those purposes. So that also needs to be taken into account, because if you're using my location to determine what is the closest financial institution nearby that I might want to enter, then that particular data item may only need to be stored for a few minutes, whereas my phone number, if you're just going to call me to contact me for marketing purposes, might be needed for a short amount of time, but to ensure its use for other types of things, it would be much longer. So again, proportionality now becomes something that, while it might seem simple that, okay, I'm just going to archive everything every X months or X years, that isn't feasible. It doesn't answer really the GDPR requirements. Even the GDPR requirements and policies themselves, how do you go about enforcing the ones that relate to data access, data storage, data transfer, if you can't even model the policies themselves? Because if you want to automate policy enforcement, you need to be able to model the policies themselves. So that's also something that we're addressing. And lastly, another key challenge is, how do you address consent? While it might have been sufficient in the past to have a checkbox in a form and just store the checkbox, the fact that that checkbox was ticked, that's no longer sufficient, because as we said earlier, the consent is now per purpose, and the consent has to clearly indicate which data for which purpose is collected, and there needs to be an audit trail of how that the consent is changed over time, and ensure the consent can be dynamic and flexible. And in my interpretation and that of others, that means allowing something beyond just today's opt-in for everything or opt-out for everything, but rather providing opt-in, opt-out per purpose, and maybe even down to the level of what data is collected for what purpose. So modeling and storing all of the options that can be presented, as well as all of the user consent contracts, then becomes very complex. So how does it work today? Today, sensitive data is obviously collected. Role-based access is the way it's safeguarded. In other words, you might have somebody who's a system administrator who would have very easy access to all the data versus a role of a marketer or a role of a financial advisor. Those are the ways that the data is being protected today, but it doesn't actually link in directly to the consent that was signed, nor to the data usage policies as they're defined by the enterprise, as they're defined by GDPR, et cetera. So the consent and the policies really tend to be just legal documents that are stored somewhere and not linked in any way, shape, or form to the data itself. And so what we're proposing and what we've created here in IBM Research is a way to technically link that sensitive data both to the data usage policies, that of GDPR, that of your particular enterprise, plus other policies that might be relevant to your industry, as well as the data subject's consent. And by linking those things to the data itself, as well as obviously the purpose, you can now provide the purpose-based data access. And so that at a high level is the big paradigm shift that we're presenting here today. So the high-level elevator pitch of what it is we're doing is, as you can see at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock on this diagram, we're providing tools to model the consent templates. In other words, what are the consent options to be presented to the end user? This maps to the definition of a purpose and the data that's associated with the purpose, so that those options can be clearly displayed to the end user and they can provide their consent preferences. On the other hand, we're also enabling the modeling of the data governance policies. And these policies will often indicate, for example, when consent is required, when it is not, general policies about how data may and may not be used, transferred, etc. So these are also modeled and leveraged by the enforcement engine. And what's important about this approach is that rather than hard-coding the consent preferences and the policies into the applications themselves, we're enabling these to be defined by privacy specialists, by product offering managers in a centralized repository. So the developers no longer become the gatekeepers for all of the privacy and compliance. This has two benefits. From the consumer perspective, we're increasing the consumer trust because we can now be very, very transparent about what data is collected for what purposes and provide a level of flexibility that consumers didn't have in the past. And on the bottom part of this diagram, because we've linked technically all of the policies and consent with the data itself, we can now automate the enforcement of all of this. And because this is automated, we can also automate the proof of compliance. So we're going beyond just creating a checkbox types compliance process to one that's generated by the IT systems themselves. So today, if we look at a consent agreement, it looks much like what we see on the slide here. It's a take it or leave it. There's no flexibility. Honestly, this is not intelligible to most people. It's rarely read, and under the GDPR, this is more and more, this is not really considered informed and explicit consent anymore. And by the way, this consent agreement I'm showing here is from an IBM mobile application. So if we were to change the paradigm, we can envision the consent contracts looking very different. So here we show an example consent screen from a demo application that we created. It's simply a fitness application that collects information about how often you cycle or jog and things like that, which obviously has a lot of very sensitive data behind it. And here you can see that that data can be used for things like fitness encouragement. You could potentially share it with your physician for personal medical services. You might want to share it with a retailer to get promotions for running shoes or other sports equipment, perhaps to your insurance company to get benefits as you're improving your health and decreasing your risk from an insurance perspective, and maybe you want to share it for just general medical research. These are all purposes, and these screens show that you can opt in, opt out. You can indicate perhaps minimum level of data. And at the bottom, as you choose these different options, you can see the exact types of data that would be collected for each of these different options. Now, this is just an example GUI screen made by our research team. Obviously, we haven't invested a lot in the UX portion of this. It's just meant to show how you can change the paradigm from what we saw on the first screen to the one here and the level of transparency and flexibility that can be provided. You can also, as a result, provide feedback to the end user exactly how their data was used, what it was approved for, what it was when it was denied, and for each of these different purposes. So this is a screen showing you from the perspective of the different purposes. You can also look at it from the data point of view and drill down. So if you want to see how often your phone number was used, you can see it here, and when you click on that, you can see exactly by what service it was used. And there are advanced APIs for accessing all of these, and again, can be used with various different GUIs and for different purposes. We do have a live demo, which I don't think we have time to show today, but it is available and you can see it on YouTube. So how do you go about defining the purposes and defining things from the perspective of an offering development manager or from the privacy officer in your organization? So the screens we saw in the previous demo had the purposes of retail discounts, medical research, etc., which you can see listed here on the left-hand side. These are services which are orthogonal to purposes, and for each of these purposes, when you define them, you can indicate the categories they are related to, the jurisdiction for the purpose. You can link to the actual legal document in which the terms and conditions are associated. And at the bottom of the screen here, you have a list of the data items that are associated with the particular purpose. So this is how you're making the link between the data items and the individual purposes. For each data item, you map it to where it is stored in your organization, and there can be multiple places where it is stored. In this case, you see a destination object and a destination field. If this is a relational database, that would map to a table and a column. It might be a data object in an object store or various other types of data stores. As you can see, you can note whether this is a mandatory data item for this particular purpose, whether it can be anonymized for this particular purpose, and its level of sensitivity. And you can see that there's also a field called duration. This is the field that I hinted at when I mentioned proportionality earlier, in that how long is this data need to be stored for this particular purpose. And while I won't go into this in great detail here, if you were to look at the data model for the fitness application we created, for each of the different types of services or purposes that we highlighted, the settings for the data items would be different. So some things are mandatory for fitness encouragement that would be optional for others. So medical care, obviously first name, last name, birth name, gender, those types of things are mandatory. And as I flip through, you'll see the settings are different for the different purposes, even though the underlying data model is exactly the same. And this is a graphical representation of what I showed you in the previous screens about mapping the data schema to the actual purposes. When you talk about modeling the data usage policies, such as the ones from GDPR, we provide a hierarchy. So you can create policy groups. It could be things like HIPAA, PCI. In this case, we're talking about GDPR. It could also be organizational policies specific to your enterprise. Within that, you can create a policy hierarchy. For example, even within the GDPR, there are policies that are slightly different or can be different per country. If, for example, it's the age of a minor, GDPR enables that to be set differently per country. And also your own enterprise organizational policies may differ per country, and so we provide the flexibility to support such things. For each policy, there's a policy input and a policy output. The policy input indicates what is the type of data associated with this policy, and sometimes there's global policy, so it's not related to a particular service or data item. Sometimes it is. The output for the different policies are when the policy is invoked. In other words, you're querying data, and the policy engine, the enforcement engine checks among all the policies that it has in its repository. It runs through all of them, and it says if you're accessing, for example, my home address, is it allowed to be used for the purposes of marketing? Yes or no? And the answer will be based on the consent and all of the relevant policies. And so the governance engine runs through all of those policies, and for each policy, the result will be either allow, with or without obfuscation, deny, or if the policy indicates that it requires consent, and thus the governance engine will check the consent itself. In this slide, I've highlighted GDPR policy examples from the perspective of IT and personal data use. When I map the GDPR purposes, when I read through the GDPR itself, I've listed here some of the example purposes. Public interest, legal claims, public health, medical diagnosis and treatment are examples. Data categories that you'll see as you go through the GDPR are things like there's the general comments about personal information, but there's also subcategories of personal information such as genetic data, biometric data, health data, etc. And these are examples. There's more. And then I take all of these. This is, in essence, my way of mapping the GDPR to our terminology to be used in our tool. And on the right-hand side of this slide are some of the example GDPR privacy policies that we would model in our tool. In terms of how to enforce this and where does the enforcement sit, there's multiple different possibilities in the IT architecture. You can put it within an application if you have an all-encompassing, for example, CRM application. You can put it down at the data layer itself to make it least likely for somebody to get around it. You can use a security suite such as Guardium or other vendors and put it as integrated in as part of that. You could also put it at the API layer. Again, where you put it, and you can sometimes put it in multiple places, depends largely on the functionality in your enterprise and the architecture of your enterprise. But to give you an example of how an enforcement point works, if we take an example of an application that collects medical information from a clinical trial, a pulmonary clinical trial, it might accept data such as age, gender, distance run, the path run, etc. The clinical trial has an enforcement point. That enforcement point, it doesn't matter where it sits, whether it's over the data store at the API level. When the data is queried, that enforcement point captures that query and sends the query to the data policy and consent manager and asks it for this policy and for this purpose, in this case a pulmonary clinical trial, where the data subject is Joe Smith and the data fields are what we mentioned, age, gender, distance, paths, etc. Can I access this data for the clinical trial? The data policy and consent manager in this case will say yes. And so the data will be returned. For the purpose of retail, the answer might be yes, but only if you generalize the information so that you might know where the person ran and when, but not exactly where in terms of the general vicinity, maybe the city or the state, but not down to the details of exactly where he ran. And if you were to do the same thing for an insurance discount, it may very well be that in this case, Joe Smith actually opted out for this, and thus the access is denied. So the enforcement point, in essence, is receiving the query, asking the data policy and consent manager what they are and are not allowed to use that data for, and then either blocks the return of the data or returns it, or where required, obfuscates it first and then returns it. So that at a high level is what our asset does. Another important component, especially when you're talking about the GDPR, is because all of this is automated, you can automatically then generate consent and data policy enforcement reports. This is an example from a pilot we did. So if you have an audit in your organization, or you're just generally monitoring how data is being used, when it's being approved and denied, you can simply run one of these reports and have this automatically generated for you. So to summarize, the problem space that we've identified is that while there's GDPR and many other compliance regulations around privacy across the world, the IT systems today aren't built to automatically enforce such regulations. Neither are they built to enable an enterprise to easily identify what has been consented to by the end user. And so these are all areas that our asset is addressing, and we believe that one of the ways to ease your compliance with GDPR is to look at such systems that can automate at least part of the process, if not a large percentage. So thank you very much, and I will pass back to Dennis now.
Thanks, Seema. So fascinating about the things that we now have to think about that previously we haven't had to think about, such as purpose, such as consent management. So how does that impact the role of governance and oversight in GDPR implementation? Well, I think there's two aspects to this. Firstly, because of the amount of risk-based regulation that we've had to deal with over the last 7 years, governance has matured hugely. And there are a lot of disciplines in place in terms of capturing what data have we got, where is that data, what are the controls, what are the quality, what's the remediation process, what's the policies, what's the architecture look like, how are we auditing it, how are we governing it. A lot of work has been done, and GDPR can leverage off the back of that. What we have to do in addition to govern data for GDPR is to firstly extend our scope so that we're looking at all the different places that personal data will be stored in. We have to categorize and make sure that we understand the categorization of personal data, so that we record that, so that we know about the sensitivity of certain types of data and where that data may be held. And we have to weave that into our overall governance processes. So lots of conventional governance. We have to extend the scope of that to make sure we cover all the places where we've got personal data, and then we have to enhance our governance activities to make sure that we understand how we're going to control or have oversight of privacy by design, the modelling and implementation of purpose, the modelling and implementation of consent management. So big challenges for architecture, big challenge for change management, big challenge for BAU, because an awful lot of BAU is going to have to be probably manually adapted for a year or two, and as our architecture and systems catch up with some of the changes that have to be made for GDPR. So lots to do as far as governance and oversight is concerned. The other thing that is absolutely key is to understand that GDPR is not a tick in the box regulation. It's not a question of there's article number 35, this is what we have to do, implement that, move on. Article number 36, move on. It's a much more pervasive regulation. that seeks to empower everybody in the organisation so that everybody is aware of their obligations with respect to data subjects, and everybody is capable of making sure that if they see a breach, potential breach, weakness, flaw in the system, that they should be able to communicate that. Or they should either be able to fix it, or they should be able to communicate it to their supervisor or to some regular compliant or governance organisation within their organisation that will capture, record, and process any potential flaws or weaknesses, and make sure that they are rooted into some governance prioritisation program, and ultimately some data quality or oversight improvement, controls improvement, to make sure that progressively, wherever you are, if you see an issue with data, you can fix it or you can get it fixed. So it covers a number of different things. So there is an overall cultural imperative. So what we're doing from an EDMworks point of view, we're putting free explanatory videos on GDPR up on the website. They're available now. If you Google EDMworks Data Management Agenda for Privacy, then you'll see 3 videos straight away. Play those, about 30 minutes in total. That will give you an awful lot of insight into what GDPR is about and what you need to be doing and what you shouldn't do. We have an e-learning general awareness module called GDPR Key Facts and Impacts. There are senior management briefings to explain to senior management the subtleties of, or some of the straightforward issues of GDPR and some of the subtleties involved. Senior management have a lot of new accountabilities. They will not have the time to do that, so there is a requirement to train up key staff, SMEs, some data stewards around the organisation so that they are aware of the special provisions that the company has put in place for GDPR, and that they are capable, or indeed they are the go-to people in those areas. So if anybody needs to know what to do about a GDPR issue or a GDPR breach, they're there to know what to do and how to connect people in to get things sorted. We've already seen there are a lot of architectural challenges and modelling challenges around consent and purpose, so we have a data modelling, data architecture course to focus on that, to make sure that good quality architecture for privacy and design is put in place. And of course, the people who are looking at systems, looking at processes to make sure they are compliant, like audit risk compliance, and controls and oversight people, that they have a clear understanding of what the end architecture is that people are looking, that the organisation is looking towards, and that as they go through and see weaknesses or challenges or issues in particular processes or systems, that they can constructive audit suggestions for improvement that combine with things that are happening in other areas, so that we align all these change activities, what we do about audit points, so that we align all these things so that everything creates a convergence around a good architectural vision for the company that we implement, that works effectively, not just to make sure that we're compliant with GDPR, but to make sure that we have a terrific and effective system of engaging with customers, of simplifying our systems, of getting rid of redundant databases, so that we have a productive, efficient environment. Final point, what advice would you give to practitioners implementing GDPR? So at this point, over to Phil and Seema.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of areas to look at here, but from the conversations that I've been involved in Brussels, GDPR is there to support primarily the digital single market. That's a key strategy for the European Union, and GDPR is a key element of that, because what a digital single market needs is trust by its citizens that their data is being held securely and is being used for what they've agreed it to be used for, and no other purpose. So from where we are now to where we need to be for that to be the case. It's, there are shades, and it depends which member states you're in as to what the current data protection guidelines state and what GDPR states. So as a first step, I would recommend, and certainly the conversations that we're having really all involve an analysis of where is your current data protection process as a business, as a legal entity, and where does it need to be and where are the gaps. And I think that the main presentation today around the consent management is going to be the main area where there will be differences, because up until now organizations haven't had to make it easy for citizens to have their data edited or deleted, to have that access given, or to be super clear on consent and why this data is being used. So as a first point of advice, I would suggest do that analysis, Dennis.
Okay, great, Phil, thanks. Seema, what's your takeaway? What would you like people to take away from this?
I think my main takeaway is again, number one, to start thinking in terms of purposes and thinking of consent in the way as we discussed, and also realizing that this is both a requirement and an opportunity, I think, because in addition to wanting to comply with GDPR, I think it's an opportunity to build trust with your customers. And by leveraging the way by enabling you to be transparent and by enabling you to provide a level of control to your end customers, you can leverage this both as a differentiator as well as just to comply with GDPR.
Final point, thank you very much to our participants. Thanks from me, Dennis Slattery, and thanks to Phil Hingley and Seema Nadler from IBM. And thank you for joining us. We'll notify you when the webinar is available. Then thank you and goodbye.